Good afternoon. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to today's discussion, co-hosted by the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Europe Center on the future of trade between the European Union and Mercosur. After decades of negotiations, the recent announcement of the approval by the European Commission of the trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union has been a welcoming piece of news at a time when free trade itself, once the cornerstone of global development, has come under growing pressure. I founded the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center with the mission of further elevating Latin America and the Caribbean into the world stage. And as such, we have long advocated for the opportunities that the region can seize for lasting economic growth by opening its markets to the global economy. The relationship between the European Union and Mercosur is a powerful example of this opportunity. Together, these two blocs represent more than 700 million consumers and over 120 billion in annual trade. And that is why we welcome the news from Brussels as a sign that there are still vast opportunities for the region. As we look to the signing of the agreement in Asunción on Saturday, January 17th, today's conversation will unpack the opportunities ahead for both blocs as they are set to form together one of the largest economic zones in the world, accounting for 1/4 of the world's GDP. We are especially pleased to be joined by Tatiana Prazeres, Foreign Trade Secretary at Brazil's Ministry of Development, Industry, Trade and Services, and Ambassador Petros Mavromichalis, the European Union's ambassador to Uruguay. We're grateful to both of you for taking the time to share your perspective at this pivotal moment. And we look forward to hearing about the real-world implications of this agreement with experts from the EU and South America. And now I turn the floor to Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Center.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Really appreciate your excellent opening of this really seismic event, as Adrienne laid out, the historic importance of the upcoming signing of the EU-Mercosur deal. Just it cannot be underscored how seismic this is for both regions. So thank you so much, Adrienne, for not only for joining and opening, but also all of this work would not be possible without your vision many years ago to start a center to elevate the importance of Latin America and the Caribbean. Secretary Prazeres, Ambassador Mavromichalis, thank you so much for joining this incredibly important conversation. It's a real pleasure to have you with us just days before the final signing of the EU-Mercosur deal. Adrienne mentioned both the speakers. I'm going to go ahead and give a more detailed introduction. Secretary Prazeres serves as Brazil's Secretary of Trade since 2023. She has a really long track record in the field of international trade. She served in the Secretariat between 2011, 2013, and as a senior trade negotiator for Brazil, really playing a key role in major bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations like the one we're here to talk about today. She's held leadership roles at the World Trade Organization and several other organizations, including Apex Brazil and the newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo. Ambassador Petros Mavromichalis, on the other hand, has worked for the European Commission and for the European External Action Service. He's served as EU ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein before traveling to Uruguay in 2025, where he serves as EU ambassador. And Uruguay is actually, of course, where the headquarters of Mercosur are located. So incredibly important for the topic of conversation today. Now, the news is very striking. The EU-Mercosur is no longer just a trade agreement under negotiation. This is what we've been talking about this entire century, an agreement under negotiation, but rather it is on the cusp of becoming a reality that's going to transform the economies of both parties for the better and creating new markets, new opportunities. But still at the same time, with such a seismic deal, the path toward implementation is still steep. That's why I'm really pleased to welcome the Secretary and the Ambassador to help unpack what this is about to what's about to take place later this week when the parties finally sign this momentous document in Asunción, Paraguay. So let's dive right into this. Let me start with you, Secretary Prazeres. For Brazil's and we'll say its Mercosur partners as well perspective, what does the signing of this agreement mean for the region, the opportunities that it opens, but also if you could help us contextualize also for the history of the region's integration and the years that the countries of Mercosur have worked on to be able to move this agreement forward?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jason. Let me just say that I'm very pleased to be here with you today talking about this very important agreement that we are about to sign. This is a very timely discussion, so I'm happy to exchange views on the issue with you all. Let me congratulate the Atlantic Council. I'm very happy to be here with Ms. Adrian Ash as well for all the good work that has been put into Latin America. So let me just start by recognizing all that. This is a landmark agreement for the region. Mercosur has been historically criticized by the limited network of agreements. So since 2023, we started to change the history with an agreement with Singapore, 2023, and the signing of our agreement with EFTA, which happened in 2025. So we concluded negotiations with the European Union in 2024. Over the past year, we worked on the translation, legal scrubbing, etc., and we're finally about to sign this very important agreement. Why does it matter? What is it so important about this agreement? So this agreement makes sense from a economic perspective, trade and economic perspective. As it's been said, we're talking about the largest agreement between two blocs. It puts together economies that account for $22 trillion. So it makes sense from a trade and economic perspective. It will help the region to be better integrated into the global economy. It will open new opportunities for us, not only in terms of exports, but also in terms of imports, making our economies more productive. Then it makes sense also from a geopolitical standpoint. We can talk more about that, but I think this is something important to highlight at this point in time. And it also makes sense from a sustainability perspective, because this was something that has been an issue in the past, but we've been able to overcome concerns and build together with the Commission a framework that helps us all be in a better position in terms of sustainability. So this agreement today sends a very powerful message to the world about two regions that believe in trade, in democracy, in multilateralism, in rules-based economic relations. And I think this changes basically Mercosur's history for the better in a very significant manner.
Thank you, Secretary. And I think as part of your opening comments, I think it's really important to reinforce how this agreement and the signing of this really reinforces kind of the Mercosur experiment from the get-go, right? And the fact that this, as a bloc, the countries can achieve new agreements together. I want to ask you a follow-up question before going to the ambassador. There's been a lot of expectations over the years that we would finally get to this signing, and it hadn't happened previously. So from your perspective, what made it possible for this agreement to finally be signed now? And as part of that, maybe if you could share a little bit about how the different teams worked together to make sure that this could be, that the agreement was finally able to get over the line at this point. Secretary Prazeres.
Oh, sorry. So I think first, the general political context helped the agreement to be concluded. Then there's leadership on our side, frankly, here in Brazil, President Lula's leadership in advancing this agreement, in helping to create convergence in the country, public sector, private sector, labor unions, everyone coming to the conclusion that a deal such as the one with the EU puts Brazil in a better place. This is something that also made a difference. And as I referred to previously, our ability to convey to the Europeans a powerful message that we believe in the sustainability agenda is something that also helped the conclusion of this agreement. I think convergence within Mercosur is something that I should highlight as well. I think on previous occasions, different political cycles in the region, different views about the agreement has created obstacles for progress on our side. Sometimes the problem was on the EU side, but I think there's been a convergence in terms of understanding about the importance of the agreement. And we finally seized the opportunity. You know, we didn't miss the window of opportunity that was in front of us where all those elements were aligned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to move from you in Brasilia to the ambassador in Montevideo. Ambassador Mauro Michalis, love to shift the conversation. You're in Montevideo, but to the European perspective. And having understood the significance of these negotiations, I think it's helpful to think about the meaning for the European Union of this really seismic agreement, the opportunities it presents, the markets that are now open for the EU and South America. Share with our viewers a little bit about how you see the opportunities, but also specifically the opportunities in Uruguay. And as part of that, if you'd like to share any additional insight on how the agreement that the Secretary spoke about convergence within Mercosur, and we also had convergence to a degree within the European Union to be able to move this agreement forward as well. Ambassador, you're on mute.
Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. This agreement is an extremely important agreement overall and for the European Union for a variety of reasons. I mean, I should state first of all that Mercosur is a very important partner for the European Union. This is a region with which we share history, culture, languages, values. So it would seem like an obvious choice to reinforce our links, political, strategic, economic, with Mercosur. From a trade point of view, I mean, this agreement serves to reiterate the EU's attachment to free trade, to a world regulated by rules and predictability. It also enables us to diversify and de-risk. Recent experiences post-COVID have shown us that it is important not to be overly dependent on a limited number of partners. We are also largely complementary with Mercosur. We have different strengths, and therefore this agreement makes sense from many points of view. In this turbulent world in which we are living, in an era where it has become fashionable to build walls, either literally or figuratively, this is a bridge. This is a bridge to Mercosur, to South America, that will enable us to trade more, and therefore will be a source of additional prosperity. We have 700,000 small companies in Europe that export to the rest of the world. Amongst those, a great number, 30 or 40,000, that export to Mercosur. There are many jobs involved. If there are more exports, there will be more jobs. So definitely an instrument for greater prosperity, but also an instrument that enables us to have a more intense conversation on any topic you can imagine, from human rights, sustainability, which was mentioned by the State Secretary, protection of the environment, climate change, labor rights, you name it. Everything can be discussed, and it is only through dialogue and discussion that you can start resolving the big challenges with which the world is confronted. As to Uruguay, Uruguay is a small, open economy, and they are very much welcoming the agreement. As I was telling you previously, the phrase that is most often heard here in relation to the agreement is that there will be a before and after in Uruguay. So a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. And I think that as a small, stable country, Uruguay has cards to play within Mercosur. It could become a hub for European companies to invest in or to locate their businesses. We are already the first investor in Uruguay. And so the fact that you will be able through Uruguay to serve a much larger market would, I expect, become a very attractive feature for our investors.
Thank you so much. Really important points on diversifying, de-risking, and also your point on how this is it's critical trade agreement, but also it's part of the broader bridge to the Southern Cone. A quick follow-up question for you from the European perspective. If you could share a little bit about the ratification process that will now occur following the signature on Asunción, especially at a time when in the EU we continue to see protests against the agreement in many member countries.
Yes, thank you for your very pertinent question. It is true that our institutional setup is a little bit complicated to the uninitiated. We have 27 member states and 450 million citizens, so not everyone sees things in the same way. Fortunately, we have qualified majority voting for such agreements. Otherwise, if unanimity had been required, we would never have been able to make it so far. And so the Council has, through qualified majority, adopted the agreement last Friday, which makes signature on Saturday in Asunción possible. And then we go to the ratification phase. And first and foremost, we will need the assent of the European Parliament. An absolute majority of members of Parliament will be required. And once this hopefully takes place, the trade part of the agreement, also known as Interim Trade Agreement or ITA, will be able to provisionally enter into force. I have to stress that from what I'm hearing, the vote in the European Parliament is not a foregone conclusion. I mean, it never is in a democratic forum, but there are those on the left and on the right, and even sometimes in amongst the center parties that oppose the agreement. There is still a lot of resistance within our countries. You have probably all heard or seen demonstrations by farmers who are concerned about their livelihoods. The Commission has tried hard to listen to those concerns, to make proposals that should go a long way towards alleviating these concerns, that it will act through the EU budget to support sectors that might be facing difficulties, that if there are disturbances on the market, we will trigger a safeguard clause, that the pesticides that are prohibited in the EU will also not be used in exports to the EU, that there will be controls. And then once the vote in the European Parliament has taken place, the agreement, the trade part, will enter into force provisionally, and then the ball goes to the member states, which each will have to ratify the agreement according to their constitutional requirements before the whole package can enter into force definitively. But this will take a much longer period of time.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for laying that out. I think it's helpful for our audience to understand the continued complexities insofar as moving from signature and Asunción on Saturday to actually having full implementation. I want to go back to Secretary Prazeres. We've spoken about the ratification process. You've spoken as well about the ratification within Brazil. What are maybe additional steps on the Mercosur side, outside of, in addition to what will happen domestically within Brazil, but then also as part of that, what do you see as some of the regulatory adjustments that may need to be made as a result of this agreement? Everything from import tariff reductions to regulatory modernization. How do you see that kind of playing out on the Brazil, but also maybe I'll even ask you on the larger Mercosur perspective?
Well, thank you very much. I think, as we've been saying, the signing of the agreement is the beginning of a new momentum for our bilateral relations, and frankly, for the modernization of trade in the two sides of the ocean. What we see here is an opportunity for us to provide stability, predictability for trade between our two regions, and therefore promoting investments, technological partnerships, integration of value chains, so on and so forth. So with the agreement, more than 90% of the tariffs on the two sides will be removed, and that with legal certainty, right? So that's what the agreement brings: legal certainty to liberalization of trade, to better conditions in terms of investment, services, procurement, and so on and so forth. So the agreement is just the beginning. What we need is the business community to be aware of the opportunities contained in the agreement. What we need is opportunities for us to promote the potential of our two regions, and therefore translate all the opportunities provided for in the framework of the agreement into real business. Business will happen with the business community on the ground.
Second, I want to pick up on that. So as you mentioned, that could present a tremendous opportunity for Brazilian business, for Mercosur business, of course, as the ambassador was saying as well on the EU side. In that context, is there a strategy, or what is the strategy in place from the Brazilian government's perspective to assist domestic firms, perhaps through government initiatives? And what can you share with in general about the government's plans to be able to ensure that that what's put on paper is actually one that Brazilian businesses are able to take advantage of?
Sure. So first, it's important to highlight that we're opening up our economy in a planned and staged manner, right? So the business community will have time to adapt, because yes, they'll be faced with the competition, with increased competition from EU products. But the EU accounts for a certain share of our total imports, 16% last year. So this exposure is a calibrated exposure to the global economy, to put it that way. At the same time, we have safeguards embedded in the agreement. We work hard to negotiate these safeguards. And we have mechanisms to somehow address disruptions that create a negative impact on trade in a way that can be properly managed. At the same time, we also negotiated with the Commission a package to support that small business in particular, can fully benefit from this agreement. So there's a cooperation package that will also be put in place to support the transition as we move along. So it's a planned, calibrated exposure to the global economy, to trade, to more trade, and that we believe will help increase productivity in our region.
So as part of that, we'll say, Secretary, this is you can expect potentially more to come insofar as Mercosur dealings with other countries, regions of the world as part of continued negotiations. I want to end with a last question to you, Ambassador Mavromichalis. The EU, and you mentioned this previously in your pointers, but that the EU has really emphasize the importance of strategic autonomy, supply chain resilience in recent years, which you've spoken about. If you could share a little more about how you see the importance of this agreement helping to diversify supply chains and also reduce over-reliance, specifically countries like China. With how does this agreement fit into even larger plans, perspectives, and opportunities?
Well, as I said before, our economies are complementary. So from that point of view, Mercosur is a good fit. And in Mercosur, you also are able to source a lot of raw materials, commodities, including the rare earths of which everybody talks about so much. And therefore, we would have greater security of supplies based on an agreement, and we would have the assurance that we would not be discriminated against and that there will not be neither import nor export restrictions, and that enables us to diversify our sources of supply, but also our export markets. And of course, this is a win-win situation for both Mercosur and for us.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I want to end this first portion of our show today by thanking you, Ambassador Mavromichalis, thanking you, Secretary Prazeres, for joining us from Brasilia and from Montevideo at this incredibly important time for Mercosur and for the European Union. A really comprehensive overview that you provided on not just how did we get here, but also what is the road ahead and what are the opportunities for the road ahead, and how does that also fit within the larger plans of the Mercosur, as well as the larger strategic imperatives from the European Union. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to now turn the conversation over to my colleague, Valentina Seder, our Director for Strategy and Programs, and also Brazil lead here at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and she will lead the next portion of our show. Over to you, Valentina.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you so much, Secretary Prazeres and Ambassador Mavromichalis, for grounding us in the strategic and political significance of this agreement. We now want to dive deeper into a conversation about what this agreement means to companies and citizens on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. And to help us unpack this, I'm pleased to welcome Fran Burwell, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and Managing Director and Head of Research at McClarty Associates, Georg Riklis, who is an Associate Director and Head of Europe's Political Economy Program at the European Policy Center, as well as Chunco Rojas, who served as Argentina's Undersecretary for International Trade and is a managing partner at Kipu Advisors in Argentina. Thank you all for joining us. And as you know, the goal of this conversation is to move from the why of the agreement to the how firms can take advantage of the agreement, where challenges remain, and what needs to happen for the deal to deliver on its full promise. We started to unpack a little bit of this with Secretary Prazeres and the Ambassador, but so to set the stage here, I wanted to get your thoughts on what we can expect next after Saturday's signing. So to start our conversation, the agreement has been described as transformative, but implementation will be complex. And we heard a little bit in the previous section about that. But Georg, I actually wanted to start with you. And from Brussels, let us know a little bit more about what do you see. The ambassador explained the next formal steps ahead for the EU, but what questions remain and what details remain to be ironed out as the deal moves onto the European Parliament for a final approval.
Thank you, Valentina, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to participate in this event. No, I think the ambassador explained it quite clearly in the sense that this deal needs to go through a vote in the European Parliament, and a vote is never a foregone conclusion. But I think momentum is really on the side of this agreement now, after 25 years, after the last few years, the last few months, and getting this over the line. So we're not in a situation where the European Parliament is in a possibility of saying, okay, you need to change this or that in the agreement. It doesn't work like that. They are to have a vote on it, and that should be hopefully the end of the story, of the negotiation story, and opens the new chapter of implementation.
And then, Fran, turning to you, 25 years later, we started these negotiations 25 years ago. What are the biggest practical challenges ahead, especially as we think about rules of origin, standards, and regulatory alignment from the European Union perspectives? What do you see as those biggest challenges?
I actually think that after all these negotiations, most of those things are pretty much settled, at least between the negotiators. This is something that I think the main challenge is going to be managing expectations. And by that, I mean that on the Mercosur side, it's going to be important to manage expectations that this might be an enormous immediate boost to the economy. Mostly trade agreements, it takes some time for businesses to figure out where the opportunities are. This agreement is very much keyed toward European industrial firms. So it's reducing significant tariffs that were in the Mercosur countries from about 35% on cars, that will eventually be gone, 20% on machinery. These are key European exports, chemicals, pharma, etc. On the European side, there is this vote in the Parliament. I also expect it to go forward, but there is the expectation in certain quarters in Europe, and particularly the agricultural lobby, and a bit on the left more generally, that this agreement will lead to floods of Mercosur products coming into, especially agricultural products, coming into the EU. And that's not the way it's written. But managing the expectations so that we can get through the next few months, and then the overall agreement must be ratified, as the ambassador said, by all the parliaments, and in some cases that means by regional parliaments as well. Canada has been stuck in this for, I want to say 5 years, Georg, but you probably know better. And the agreement can be enforced. It's going to be provisionally applied, but this is something that kind of erodes confidence in the agreement over time if they fall into that particular thing. So I think managing expectations, this is going to not be a panacea for some of the challenges that both parties are facing in trade international overall, but it is a very, very positive step forward with, as was pointed out at the very beginning, an enormous market where trade barriers are being reduced, not put up.
And I think that, Fran, on that same note, Shunko, I wanted to turn to you to see if you agree with Fran in terms of the Mercosur perspective, but also ask a question that Fran touched on and the Ambassador Mavromichalis also did, mentioning the perspective that he is hearing from Uruguay in the sense of there will be a before and after this agreement for Uruguay. Do you see that this is true for other member countries as well? But also, as you think about the question that I posed for Fran, what are some of the challenges that we may see ahead for Mercosur member countries too?
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you again. A pleasure to be here with you today and join this so interesting and timely conversation. Let me start by challenging a little bit the generalized assumption in the discussions about this agreement, that this agreement is very important, that's for sure, but not so much because of the trade flows will explode suddenly after the ratification of the agreement, but rather because of its rules, because of the predictability it can provide for investments and for the promotion of higher standards. Today, about 50% of Mercosur exports already enter the EU market duty-free. And another about almost 30% of the commodities like soybeans, which are very important for countries such as Argentina or Brazil, where tariffs are actually not a major barrier for trade. And even beef, which is, as you know, it's one of the most politically sensitive sectors, the EU quota represents about 2% of consumption. To illustrate it more bluntly, there is just one hamburger per citizen in the EU per year. So this is clearly not something that is going to disrupt the market. So the real implementation challenges, I think, are not so much about market access on paper, but about making the agreement effective and usable in practice, and particularly for SMEs. And this is pretty much aligned with the comment of Tatiana Placeros earlier. And especially on the Mercosur side, where companies, SMEs face greater challenges. So when the tariff margins are small, the compliance costs can quickly become a real obstacle. And let me give a couple of examples on, for example, rules of origin. The experience shows that in EU agreements, the preference utilization rates for operators stayed very low for many years. So, and this is due to lack of information or misinformation, compliance costs, poor capabilities of companies. And again, this has a great impact on SMEs. And I think that there's a lot of work that can and should be done, both on government side and business to adapt and invest on this, to make these opportunities on paper a real business opportunity in practice.
Also, go ahead.
Just to complement on standards and certification. In the case of the EU, in many cases, these standards are way much important than tariffs. SPS rules, traceability, environmental compliance, product safety, labeling, they are very important for real market access. And Mercosur exporters, many of them don't have this infrastructure and capabilities to meet these requirements. And finally, on the alignment, the regulatory alignment between the two blocks, I think that there are structural challenges, which in part, I think, played a very important role in making the negotiations of the agreement harder, complex, and lengthy. That is that the EU and the Mercosur have two very different governance and institutional structures. While the EU has a more centralized organization with more predictable regulations, Mercosur does not. We have different agencies, different regulations, different timelines, different interpretations. And the agreement, I think, will play a key role in helping to converge, but it's going to take time, it's going to take years, and this gap can be one of the greatest challenges in the early stages.
And Shunko, I wanted to pick up on a point that you raised about SMEs in particular, and then some of the challenges that the Mercosur member countries' firms will have in adjusting to a European market. So how should these firms be thinking about positioning themselves to compete in the EU market? You mentioned a few of the adjustments regulatorily that they would have to go through, but also as we think about SMEs in particular, the small and medium-sized enterprises, they often struggle to fully utilize trade agreements, and they play a large role in economies of Mercosur and the EU, especially in countries like Italy. What can governments and business associations, for example, do to ensure the SMEs on both sides are able to access the benefits of this deal? I'll ask you from the Mercosur side, and Jorg, I think it would be great to hear from the European Union's perspective from you. Shunko, let's start with you.
Thank you, Nadia. I think that in general, the agreement can play a huge role in lowering the market access, in market entry barriers for Mercosur firms. And SMEs can definitely be one of the main beneficiaries of the agreement. However, at the same time, as what we discussed, SMEs are the group that are most likely to miss out the opportunities. Not because the agreement excludes them, but because it requires a lot of capabilities that they often don't have, and particularly among the poorest countries, right? And I think that here both governments and business associations can play a critical role in providing information, raising awareness, offering support to SMEs on how to use and maximize the benefits of the agreement. And I don't mean just to provide information about the legal text, but rather to provide practical guides and effective capacity building efforts. And I think that there are a lot of public goods and spillover effects, positive spillover effects that the governments can promote to facilitate, for example, certification and conformity assessments. They can pull costs, they can offer shared compliance services and connect SMEs with partners on the other side of the Atlantic. And I think that this is a key role that both, again, governments and business associations can play for the effective implementation of the agreement.
Jorg, what are your thoughts from the European Union side?
I think the challenges for SMEs are roughly parallel on both sides, in the sense that SMEs, they face three main hurdles linked to trade in general, to trade agreements. It's obviously the information, it's compliance cost, and it's also scale. So whatever you can do to provide clear practical guidance on rules of origins, customs, not legal text, but the concrete guidance is important. Support shared certification, testing facilities, these kind of things. And I think also sort of business associations have an important role to act as aggregators, helping SMEs enter the Mercosur through consortia, facilitating local partnerships and these kind of things. If you're a small company, you would want a trade opportunity to be there without having to hire trade lawyers. So that's the key test for SMEs. For the sort of the previous question on what are the challenges, I agree very much with what Junko said. Obviously, there is the question of rules of origin and for also bigger companies, understanding what are the opportunities to be seen, to be seized, and do they want to rejig their global value chains in light of this agreement. And I think an important point to come in here is that here it varies quite a lot according to sectors, because the tariff elimination under the EU-Mercosur deal is gradual. It's not instantaneous for several sectors. So for most industrial goods, so the manufacturing duties start declining as soon as the agreement enters into force and will be gone within 10 years. But if you're looking at the more politically sensitive sectors like automotive, you're looking at a stretch out to 15 or more years. So I think the opportunities here lies in for manufacturing industrial goods where there is a lot to go for from a European side. I think one should not underplay the importance of services and investment, the importance of improved legal certainty for EU investors. And that can be in energy, infrastructure, professional services, these kind of things, but also public procurement, which can be important for European firms to access. What we should be aware of is, of course, remaining risks that businesses talk about here in Europe, macroeconomic volatility, currency risk, these kind of things, political and regulatory reversals, and enforcement gaps. So there is plenty of things still to work on for bigger or for small companies, but of course the smaller companies did need to be accompanied in particular if they are to make the most out of this agreement.
And then, Fran, I wanted to turn to you because I think that we got a big picture on the challenges as well as the opportunities for companies in the EU as well as in Mercosur member countries. And I wanted to shift a little bit the conversation thinking about the environmental and sustainability provisions that were so central and so politically critical for the conclusion of this agreement and for the eventual signature of it that we will see on Saturday. But how likely are these provisions to shape corporate behavior and investment decisions in practice? What was that going to look like in terms of different standards that Junko was alluding to? I wanted to hear your perspectives in terms of this particular issue.
So you're right that these environment and sustainability and labor as well requirements were a major element in the negotiations. And in fact, when the negotiations resumed, I think in 24, maybe 23, this was the centerpiece of what was worked on in order to get almost to the finish line. And then there was more to be done in terms of safeguards after that. I think that this is, in a way, a two-edged sword. To some degree, the strictness of EU requirements, and particularly things such as deforestation, but also corporate sustainability due diligence, corporate sustainability reporting directives, things of this nature, are going to make European companies look very carefully at Mercosur companies before bringing them into their supply chains. And so this will, in the initial stages, I think, inhibit some of the partnerships. However, I think that it will also offer opportunities for those companies who can deal with the compliance costs and who can make the changes to then open to them many more opportunities. Those Mercosur companies will see more opportunities in the European market, in the EU market. But it's going to divide, if you will, Mercosur companies into two groups, those that can and those that can't. And my own view is starting to be that although the trade with that Mercosur presents, that the agreement presents, is important, what also is going to be very important is the investment and the partnerships that are made, if you will, below the trade, with promises that EU companies will be regarded at the same, treated the same as Mercosur companies in public procurement. The EU already does mostly like that, not always. But I think that for those partnerships to work, there needs to be a gradual regulatory alignment. And the EU is not famous for softening its regulation in order to bring in others. So I think it's going to be mostly a matter of Mercosur moving, companies deciding that this is what they want to do in order to get into that market. And some will make it and some will stay strictly in the Mercosur market.
Fran, thank you so much for that. I think it's a warning sign there for some of these Mercosur companies, and I'm sure Shunko has thoughts on this too. So I'll open it up for him for some comments quickly before I wanted to move into a more macro global perspective of the meaning of this agreement. Shunko, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Valentina. Yes, I think that the environmental provisions in the agreement are going to be very important and critical. But I think it's important not in a direct way, and this is very practical. And I fully agree with Fran on the relevance of the environmental provisions for firms, in the sense that they will not be subject to sanctions or fines because they don't comply with environmental standards, but the provisions will operate through, access to finance, supply chains, consumer preferences in the EU. European banks, insurers, buyers, and consumers are already including the deforestation risk, carbon exposure, labor standards into their decision-making. But at the same time, I'd like to challenge a little bit Fran's ideas, because I also see that the broader picture, I think it's important to know that also the EU itself is in a process of kind of softening or delaying some of the sustainability rules. But, the deforestation regulation has been postponed, the corporate sustainability reporting directive timelines have been pushed back a little bit, some industrial standards have been diluted. So I think it remains to be seen how the whole environmental regulatory framework in the EU and more broadly at global scale unfold over time under the current geopolitical context. I think that the direction is clear, but there are some risks, not only in terms of how these frameworks evolve, but also how these frameworks, particularly in the European Union, are implemented in practice. Whether they are applied selectively or used politically, I think that would be a great problem for the agreement, because it erodes trust, and of course trade suffers as a consequence.
I think this is the richness of these kinds of conversations, that we can bring both perspectives and, try to understand and unpack what the realities will actually be. And looking into, like I mentioned, a more global perspective, we mentioned the significance of this agreement. We talked about the challenges and opportunities for both of these blocs. But as we see, global trade is suffering some pressures. Multilateralism is under question. How does the EU-Mercosur agreement fit into broader efforts by both regions to diversify partners, to strengthen supply chains, and to reduce exposure to some of these geopolitical shocks? Fran, I wanted to pose this question to you, and I have others for Shunko and Georg.
So I think that this is actually an example of a trade agreement, more or less a traditional FTA in many ways, that reduces barriers or seeks to reduce barriers. And this is directly contrary to the model being pursued by the Trump administration right now, which is a model to create prosperity by raising trade barriers. And so I think that this is both for Mercosur, but also for the EU. There is a statement behind this agreement, which is that traditional trade agreements lowering barriers is still a key to prosperity. So I think that is one of the key messages. There is also a geopolitical message, which is about diversification of supplies. We have seen, and I would say, Brazil, particularly 50% tariffs to get into the United States right now, I think. And we have seen the outrage in the EU over 15% tariffs, relatively small compared to many other countries. And this agreement, in a sense, says it is possible to go in another way. And if we find that the market in the United States is shrinking because of tariffs, we are going to go out and find other places where we can do business.
And then, Georg, following up on that, from the European Union's perspective, how do you see the EU trying to diversify partnerships and strengthen economic security? There's even a possibility of a separate EU deal with India, for example. But how does Mercosur, this deal in particular, play into this strategy? How does this factor into the EU's competitiveness agenda? I think that Fran alluded to that too, in terms of the options that we see right now. What is the EU seeking with this agreement?
Yeah, no, I think that dimension is super important, and I can only agree with what's been said. I mean, this agreement is, if you want, it's a strategic hedge in a fragmented or fragmenting global economy. And with this Mercosur deal, well, trade flows between the EU and Mercosur could grow by as much as 37%. Some estimates say, and the EU would have trade agreements with 95% of Latin America's GDP. That is significant, and so in addition to the sort of the diversification and the opportunities it creates, I think we should also look at what this means for economic security, if you like, as one talks about it now. I mean, the EU diversifies its EU sourcing of food and agricultural products, but critical raw materials, future green value chains. So this is super important. And I think also, obviously, the point that Fran is making, we'll put different words on it, but it does reinforce rules-based trade at a time when unilateralism is rising. And amid today's tariff wars, U.S. posturing, I would also say coercion, because that is what it is, what most countries are facing. Well, Brussels, European capitals clearly sees this deal as a statement in defense of rules-based trade and a rebuttal to those kind of practices and that protectionism. Does this mean that Mercosur having come thus far and India not, that there's a choice being made here? No, that I don't think. I think really the EU wants to work with Mercosur on rules-based trade and deepen that relationship, just as the EU wants to work with India on rules-based trade. And the Mercosur agreement complements rather than substitutes other partnerships like India in this world where the like-minded in terms of those who still believe in an international order rather than international disorder, and still believe in rules rather than just the use of force. Well, those like-minded countries, they need to stick together, and then they need to make agreements together.
And then, Shunko, turning to you as we think about Mercosur specifically, the bloc has been looking to diversify its export markets. Brazil specifically has definitely had this as a priority. But as Mercosur looks to explore different deals, they're negotiating with Canada. They just signed the deal. They're going to sign this agreement with the EU. What is the perspective for Mercosur member countries in terms of convergence and deeper cooperation within South America? This is also something that there are many political differences within the Mercosur bloc right now. How does this is actually showing unity for something bigger than these political disagreements?
Thank you, Valentina. Yes, again, I think that one of the most important benefits of this agreement is the institutional infrastructure that it provides for trade, but also for Mercosur countries. And I think that we have to look at these agreements as in the long-term perspective. As you know, this agreement started to be negotiated in the early 2000s. And at that time, the rationale for negotiating the agreement was one. What happened in the 2010 or 2012, there was another rationale. When we concluded the first agreement in 2015, there was another rationale, and today there is another rationale. So, and I think what is important is that beyond the political cycles, beyond the affinities or not of the political leaders at some point in time, these agreements provide this infrastructure and predictability that goes beyond the political cycles and give the predictability that business need. And in that sense, I think that, as Tatiana said earlier on, this is a very important landmark for Mercosur. I think that if this agreement was not concluded, or the European Union did not approve the signature of this agreement, the Mercosur would face a huge crisis. But I think that this is a very important landmark, and it gives the Mercosur an opportunity to continue expanding the limited network of FTAs with partners such as Canada, Middle East, and other countries in the world, which, as Greg said, they are all supportive of rules-based trade, which is in the benefit of mid-sized markets such as the countries in the Mercosur.
And with that, I wanted to take this moment. We are out of time, but we could be talking about this for many more hours. Maybe we'll have to do a second version of this after the signing of this agreement on Saturday. But I wanted to take this time to thank Shunko, Georg, Fran, Secretary Prazeres, as well as Ambassador Mavromichalis. I think that we underlined all of the opportunities that this agreement actually shows for not only the Mercosur blocs and member countries, European Union members, but also for the rules-based trading system that we have in place. And I think that there's many more implications of this agreement in the years to come. So with that, the Atlantic Council will continue to follow this agreement, and you can continue to hear from our experts in the days and years to come. Thank you so much, and have a great day.